Hello and welcome to The League Presents, a show by the League of Women Voters in Newton. My name is Margie Ross-Decter, and I currently serve on the board of the League of Women Voters, and I'm a former school committee member. I'm honored to be your host of today's program. And today's program is called Don't Just Stand There, Run. Our focus today is to develop programs to educate, encourage, and support Newtonians running for office. In this program, we aim to demystify campaigning and learn about the important jobs of representing our community on the Newton School Committee and the City Council. And if you care about as much about Newton as we do, maybe you will consider a run too. Today I will be speaking with two of my colleagues who are also former elected officials and serve with me on the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of Newton. Please join me in welcoming Alicia Bowman, who is a former Newton School City Councilor, and Kathy Shields, who's a former Newton School Committee member. Thank you both for joining us for Don't Just Stand There, Run.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Well, we have a lot of issues to talk about, so let's maybe get started. I'd like to start by sharing our experiences of running and serving in public office. And as you both know, whenever you start a public meeting, it usually starts with why did you run for office to begin with? And every candidate has their own unique story about why they ran. For me, it was personal. I don't know if you have a picture of my family. Every campaign brochure has a picture of their family on it. But on the heels of a tax override in 2008, I remember testifying at a school committee meeting with my 7-year-old son, who had just spent the first week of school seeing his school class size in second grade mushroom to 30 kids. I discovered that there was a citywide enrollment boom and that school buildings were also in disrepair. And more importantly, the programs that they relied on were starting to become on the chopping block. I was working full-time as a consultant and had 3 kids, 8, 6, and 3 at the time, yet I felt compelled to step up and to make a difference for all of our kids. And those 8 years are really among the most rewarding I've had in my career. So I'm gonna kick it over to you, Kathy, and just hear what is your campaign story?
So mine, I can't say it started quite the same way, but one of my neighbors was a sitting school committee member from my ward. And he called me up one day, to me it felt out of the blue, and said, hey, so I'm not going to be running again. I've reached my term limit. Is this something you'd ever think about doing? And so at that point in time, I had a second grader. I'd been volunteering with my elementary school's PTO for a couple of years, taking on some increasingly larger roles. And I was at that point where my youngest was 3. And so you know that switch when your 2-year-old turns 3 and all of a sudden they can do things? And I was like, oh, I'm going to have a lot more free time. I think
famous last
in
words.
Retrospect, completely nuts, because I had 3 kids, I don't know, I guess they were at that point, 8, 5, and 3, or 7, 5, and 3, and I worked full time, but it was something I was very interested in. I had been on my school's school council. Always interested in public education. I sort of credit a lot of where I have been, I've come in life from my public school education. So it was something I cared a lot about. And so I started attending school committee meetings. I attended them for probably a year and a half or so before I was elected. And all of the issues were fascinating. And so it was something I decided to do.
That's great, and we're so lucky that we had you. I'll kick it over to Alicia. What was what made you compelled to run?
Excellent. I also had a very personal reason. I had been very involved in the city for many years, both through the PTO as PTO president and then the PTO council, and I started an organization called Safe Routes to School to promote kids being able to walk and bike to school, and working with people with disabilities, and president of Bike Newton. And it was never in my thought that I would ever run for elected office. I went to a lot of meetings and saw how hard the school committee and the city council worked for the city, and I had always decided I'm much better advocate, pushing on things. And my in-laws, who my husband grew up in Newton, and his father was a teacher for 30 plus years in the Newton Public Schools, when they needed to downsize, they could no longer safely drive, and they wanted to stay in Newton. And I said, fine, we'll go find you a place to live, and even started getting involved in housing. And then I realized housing advocacy, and I realized we needed more elected officials who cared about building the kind of housing that was going to be appropriate for seniors to downsize, for young people to move back home, and realized I probably couldn't fix it for my in-laws, but I really wanted to fix it so that my husband and I would have a place to move when we wanted to downsize. My children were much older. I think my youngest was 16 when I decided to run, and had 2 kids in college at that point. So I had the time, and I had many years of advocacy work that I really understood the issues, and I understood how the city ran. So, yeah, I had friends who were like, you have to run. We've been asking you for years. You now have to run. And because I was complaining about a city meeting and unhappy about how some of our officials were thinking about Newton not being a place where we could potentially build more housing and change sort of the conversation.
Well, isn't that always how it happens? That you complain about something, and next thing you know, you've stepped up and you're running for office.
Exactly.
So do something about
Do
it.
something about
Don't
it.
just stand there, run.
Do something about it.
Right? Don't just stand there,
Exactly.
run. So I'm hoping that we can pull up at this point the map of our city, the city of Newton, because I think it's really not that many people view the map of Newton this way. I actually live on the south side of Newton. Most people never even come to my side of Newton, but I think it's helpful to have that as a context for us to walk through how the city council and the school committee are organized. So I was wondering if, Leisha, maybe you can talk through sort of big picture about the ward structure of our city, and then just talk a little bit about the representation on the city council side.
Sure. So there are 8 wards, and each ward has 4 precincts, basically they're somewhat equally divided. They do their best every 10 years with the census gets to change, equally divided with the number of residents, not necessarily the number of voters. So like Ward 7 that you represent has fewer voters, and Ward 4 because you have college students in them. But I'm in Ward 6, this blue right here in the middle, which is mostly Newton Center, a little bit of Newton Highlands. And on the city council side, we have 24 city councilors, which is a lot. That's a whole separate effort. We talked about trying to decrease those, but for city council, you have 3 councilors that are elected from each ward, 2 that are elected by the whole city but have to live in that ward, and then 1 who is elected just by the people who live in that ward.
Okay, so there are 8 ward councilors, 1 from each ward.
Right, and there are
then
16 at-large, 2 who live in each of the wards.
Great.
So it's spread across the city.
And Kathy,
And
did you
on
want to
the-
talk about the school committee side?
Sure, yeah. So on the school committee side, we have 9 members, so 1 from each ward. You have to live in the ward to run for that ward seat, but every school committee member is elected citywide, which means every resident votes for all 8 school committee members. And then the 9th member of the school committee is the mayor. And that's a really, it's a great way to have input from the mayor and to know that she understands everything that the school committee is working on, because there's an important budgetary connection there.
Right, just say a little bit more about the budgetary and sort of, how like the mayor, the school committee, and the city council might overlap, just on, knowing that the entire city budget is, it's a lot of money.
So it is a lot of money, and the school piece of the city budget is the largest by far single piece. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% of the city's budget is the NPS, the Newton Public Schools budget. And so we go through a budget process every spring. We, as the school committee, vote on the budget that the superintendent approves, or the superintendent proposes, the school committee approves. We then send it to the city council, who reviews the school committee's budget as part of its overall deliberations about the city's budget.
Right, and then on the city side, we sort of receive the budget already done. There's not a lot the city council can do, but I will say that our current mayor, Mayor Fuller, has taken efforts in her time in the city to seek out input from the city councilors about what our budget priorities are, and maybe that helps to shape a little bit. We have had years like during COVID when we needed to actually reformat the budget after it had been submitted because COVID came in after they had done many of the calculations, and it was going to change both what revenue was going to be coming in. If you don't have people eating in restaurants and staying in hotels, you're having a small hit there, or parking meters. They needed to cut some expenses, and we worked hard to lobby for things like keeping the library open and fully staffed, and trying to find other ways that we could support a budget. So we do have lots of budget hearings where we discuss a lot about the budgets and learn about the budgets, but the city council has minimal control in most years over what happens to the budget. We do get to propose budget amendments in hopes that the mayor will consider funding them, which is how we did the bike and pedestrian plan, which is one that was accepted. We propose many every year that are not accepted as well.
Yeah, I mean, school committee does a budget priorities session and document that we give to the superintendent, and then along the way there are also budget workshops with the superintendent, the school committee members, and the senior staff. So our views on priorities are taken into account in formulating the budget. A large part of our budget, though, is compensation. So it's essentially fixed by our contracts.
Right.
So I guess before we get into like the campaign logistics and the rest of it, while we're talking about the substance of what we do in the job, if you could just talk a little bit more about the structure. So up here right now is really the overview of how the city council operates. So can you just talk a little bit about the committees and just high level what kinds of issues might be covered? It doesn't need to be within each committee, but just a couple.
Sure.
Highlight just a couple.
Yeah, sure. So first, it's every city councilor is assigned to 2 committees. You're in one of the first 3, either finance, land use, or zoning and planning. And then you're assigned to one of the 3 Ps, so programs and services, public facilities, and public safety and transportation. I think finance is pretty self-explanatory. They do have to, throughout the year, approve things like expenditures if they're going to be different than they were from the budget, or settlements that have to happen. You know, a snow truck takes down somebody's fence, it needs a settlement, things like that. Zoning and planning make the rules, and that actually got a lot of play in the last 4 years in the council. They make rules around what can be built where, and so a lot of the rezoning that we did to meet the MBTA Communities Act was first drafted by those committees. And all of the work that happens at the committee level is worked on by the committee, voted on by the committee, but then voted on by the whole city council. So even things that don't pass an individual committee could still pass at the full city council because, but in every committee is represented with one person from every ward. Programs and services deals with things like the library and the senior center and the health department, and public facilities deals with the bulk of the roads, the public buildings, the school buildings, all of that. And permitting, any changes in the streets, and public safety and transportation basically mostly oversees the fire department and the police department. That's really what happens.
Great.
So,
That's really helpful. If we could advance, we can learn a little bit more about the school committee structure that, that it meets fewer times a week, but it's really power-packed. There's a lot that's done on its own. So
Sure.
if you're able to
Yeah,
walk
so
us
I
through a
can-
little bit of
I'm not going to read this to you,
Yes.
but and these committees change over time as different issues arise. But some of the standing subcommittees include communications. How are we communicating with our constituents and our school families? Policy, so we have a pretty hefty policy manual that changes all the time, both in response to changes in the law and just updates based on what we're doing. Collective bargaining is a big effort of the school committee. We bargain with the 3 unions who employ the Newton Public Schools staff. Long-term planning and facilities sort of go together. It's talking about the buildings we have, what they need to be for the future. And then for each actual building project, there is a separate school building committee on which 1 or 2 school committee members sit. So in addition to those things, there are other committees on which a school committee member needs to be part of the discussion. So on the city's financial audit committee, we have a school committee member assigned to be a delegate to the Mass Association of School Committees, to the Newton Youth Commission, and then liaisons to a whole bunch of different family groups, things like the CPAC, the Special Education Parents Advisory Council, the LPAC, the English Language Learners Parents Advisory Council, Forge, and other programs. And then there are other roles that sort of come up. Some of these are standing committees and some are in response to issues that arise. We've listed a bunch of those there.
For sure, for sure. It's a lot to cover, right?
So it's a lot to do other than just being a school committee member. You are also assigned to multiple of these groups, and I think people tend to take on more of these roles the longer they serve.
Is there any issue in particular that you felt like had a particularly soft place in your heart, or?
So in my first term, I spent a lot of time working on the PTO Equity Spending Committee. We did a sort of revamp of the rules relating to sort of how PTOs spend their money and what kinds of things they can spend it for, because what we had seen in the data was a very significant and perpetual disparity between what some schools can spend versus what other schools can spend. And in sort of emphasizing that we really want students across Newton to have the same educational experience, that raised issues. So I spent quite a bit of time working on issues relating to that.
Pretty thorny, because actually the 8 years prior to when you served, I served on that committee as well. So it was a process. Sometimes there are issues that go on for a very, very long time. So that's great. Do you want to comment in particular? I mean, the collective bargaining obviously was a big deal last year. Conclusion. Is there something that you learned from that process in terms of really before it hadn't been quite so public? So I'm just curious about how you experienced that.
Sure. So I served on the collective bargaining committee in the negotiations that led up to the strike, and even though I was technically finished on the school committee, I stayed on through the strike because I was a part of that team. And so I think you are right that in the last round, the school committee decided to be a lot more public about what its positions were. I think because there was a lot more information out there, and we felt like parents and voters should understand what these negotiations were about.
Yeah, absolutely. Communication, back to the list, communication I think has kind of cut across all of the issues, right? Yeah. So in particular, I'm just curious about transparency and public input. That's been something that's evolved as well. Back in the day, I feel like it's the heyday or whatever the day was that, we really waited for the Newton tab, to come out, and that was kind of, what we read about, and if it wasn't reported on, that was the end of it. And of course, we're sitting here in New TV today, and we're so grateful for this community resource, and we want to make sure that we're taking advantage. And I know that was one of the major investments they did this year, is to be able to cover all of the events that are happening at City Council. They say gavel to gavel coverage at both the subcommittees and the committee level. So I'm curious, how has that changed how the City Council has operated, knowing that things are available real time. They can also watch it on their own time from the, with their popcorn and their hot cocoa, at home and their fuzzy slippers. How does that change the way that people have been more engaged or not in terms of the issues you're covering?
Well, I think from a city council perspective, obviously it started during COVID, right? So, holding meetings on Zoom, which would then, work with New TV to also be co-broadcasting that. Certainly it felt like many more people could show up to a meeting. And, when I was first elected, it was one of the things I wanted to do was to be able to have a way for people to be able to participate in city council meetings, less from the elected official standpoint and more from the resident standpoint, because I knew many people who were older or had young children or had a disability might be at a disadvantage of being able to make it out on a cold winter's evening, especially on the committee. I was on land use, was one of the committees I was on, which land use can go till 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and to ask somebody to sit on a hard bench for 3 or 4 hours waiting for their item to come up. It's much easier to think about that being at home. And people thought I was a little crazy that we would have remote participation. 2 months later, of course, COVID came around, and we did have remote participation because it was forced upon us. And I actually think it's a very good thing to give people that opportunity to observe, to participate, I mean, there's a lot of data out there, especially on the land use side, about the people participating in meetings tend to be older and whiter and wealthier and homeowners, and more so than the general population. So, you know, if we want to have representative input, then we need to find ways to get input from people beyond the standard. And I'm sure you have that in school. Like the school committee input's much easier to hear from the parents whose kids are much older.
It is, although, I mean, parents who get organized around a particular issue have no problem coming out.
Yeah.
We always had a fairly robust public comment process. Right. But when the pandemic arrived and we started doing meetings virtually, we definitely saw participation go way up. I mean, back in the day when you had to go in person to make your public comment or to really observe the meetings live. I mean, you could do it on TV, but not a lot of people did that. And we certainly had regulars who were in the room every 2 weeks. But the number of people who regularly watched school committee meetings went way up when they were televised, like when they were live on Zoom, and you could just log into the webinar, and it made it so much easier for people to watch the pieces of meetings they were interested in while they were making dinner and taking care of the kids.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about just the role of social media and sort of, it used to be that you'd run into Whole Foods and, you know, people would grab you while you're picking out bananas and they bend your ear about some issue that they either watched on TV or they heard about in the newspaper. How has social media impacted the way that you did your job, you know, back then, and maybe even reflecting on, because we all have been out of office for a little while, how would that change the job going forward? Do you think that people are engaging in conversation that way? How are people engaged, put it that way?
So I think there are a number of social media outlets where people do engage in dialogue. I don't know that it's the same kind of conversation, though, that happens in person, because I think that people interact with each other differently on social media than they interact when they're talking face-to-face to someone. I think it tends to be less courteous, and not the. I think there's an opportunity to hear what you want to hear rather than have to explain something to someone or hear what someone else is saying. I think that is a potential downside negative of the social media influence.
And I was actually going to ask Alicia that, you know, wearing our board hat, you know, of the League of Women Voters, you know, civil discourse has been a major part of one of our concerns about making sure that people they have the facts, that they're doing their homework and they're talking about it in a courteous way. I'm just curious if you had any comment on either the opportunity for the League and our community to really change the civil discourse.
So such a good question. I mean, I might start by just backing up real quick and just making the point that that it's very important as an elected official that social media is depending on how you use it, it could be a violation of open meeting law. So it has to be, social media really from an elected official standpoint really sort of has to be one-sided, like I'm publishing information about it, but I'm not interacting on an issue. So people may reach out to you you put out a post, show up for this meeting for land use, then people want to engage you in it. You can't do that because that's a violation of open meeting law. And people get sort of frustrated about that. Certainly, there is lots of, you know, I think I was following that on the strike, and people just coming up with their own theories about why things are happening or how things are happening, and that's very frustrating. I think that's why we have, I don't know about school committee, but we have many older elected officials who've chosen just not to be on social media. That's their answer. They just won't be on social media. They can't be approached on social media, and they feel like they're not. And I'm not sure that that's the best answer, because it is a really good way to, you know, to reach out and to get your name known so that people know. I mean, I used to publish a monthly newsletter so that people would know what was happening, and you could engage with people directly with that. But,
Well, so I was hoping that we could kind of go back just to the nuts and bolts, because this is really an overview of what it would take to run and to serve, and I think we've gotten a good sense of the exciting things, the opportunities that are before us, the new tools, new communication tools, ways to engage with the public. Certainly, subjectively, that not everything do you come with, before you started, that you learn a ton. And I know both of you are really great examples of people who are out in the community learning and listening. So that's a big part of it as well. So I'm going to get to the fun stuff of just, if we can't call it Don't Just Stand There, Run, without talking about how do you run, right? So there's a thing. So let's walk through what happens when you decide to run. What's the very first thing that you do? You run down to?
Well, I don't know if that comes first.
Yeah, long before.
Okay.
Okay.
All
I
right.
would say the very first thing you do is you pull together your team.
Yeah.
Okay.
You pull together. It's very important that if you're going to run for office, that you have a team of people to advise you and to help you get the work done. I mean, it's hard to run for office, and you really need a good support team. So that's number one. And then you're going to do things like you're going to develop your positions. You're going to start to put together materials like this, like your palm card and your mailers, and you're going to develop a website, and you're going to register
A finance
a
committee.
finance committee, and you're going to register to be able to collect campaign donations. Those are really the sort of first things that happen.
And you're also going to go meet with
Oh, yeah.
about 1,000 people. You're going to meet with anybody who will meet with you. People who are current members of the body you're running for, former members of that body, influential people in the community who have who work on groups that are related to the work that you
Right.
want to do. I mean, you're going to meet with anybody and everybody who will meet with you. And then I'd say eventually, after you've been doing that for some number of months,
Yeah.
then we get to the pulling papers
Okay, so yes,
stage.
it's just sort of the legal part of it. So
Yeah.
of course there's the big announcement, right? Like when are the papers going to be available, right? So when you pull papers, and I remember, at the time that we used to have a lookout, people, because everybody has to run every 2 years, right?
Right.
The whole entire everybody's up for re-election every 2 years. So whether you have an opponent or not, then that's when you run. And in fact, I just want to take a little segue for that for the time being, because that conversation that you have with your advisory group really does depend on do you have competition. So I'm curious, Alicia, that you've run a number of times. Sometimes not every time with competition.
Every time.
Every time. Well, lucky you.
Yeah.
So
I
it's-
ran 3 times. I beat an incumbent the first time, and I won the second time, and then I lost my third race.
Okay.
Yeah.
It happens.
So it happens.
It happens. I mean, there were really, I think, for your issue, your campaign in particular, it seemed that there's a specific issue on the ballot, so to speak, and I think there were a number of people who are working on that topic that all of them turned over,
Yeah.
right? In terms of that. So
It had some impact, housing, if you're talking about zoning.
Housing,
Yes, I think the bigger impact probably for my election was the 528 projects in your ward, in Ward 8. So big discussions there.
yes, for sure. So in terms of is there a takeaway for like how you would run differently in a competitive race versus not competition? You're one of the few, actually, Alicia, that because there's really not been. I don't know if you can comment on City Council how many of the races generally have been contested. It's not that many.
It's not usually. I'd have to go back and look, but I want to say there's usually 3 or 4 races
out of 24.
Out of 24 seats. So if you're running, there are like 3 people running for 2 seats. There's probably usually no more than 4 contested races, and sometimes it's 1 or 2, in general. So there are many people on the City Council who've never had a contested race and have been in office for decades. So that is something that, it's an interesting tidbit of politics.
And it's common on the school committee not to have contested races. I think there are often more contested races when there's an open seat. In other words, when an incumbent is choosing not to run again. But even in those races, or even in those situations, there's not always a contested race. I think a lot of people realize how much work it is, and it's hard to find a lot of people who are willing to say, I'm signing up for that voluntarily.
Yeah, and we've been lucky. I mean, I think a lot of people who do step up really bring a lot to the table, and you know, it's you know, we're blessed in Newton. I think that we have a lot of people who care, and you know, sometimes it's one of those things. People have a rich history in the schools, and other people just are bringing their professional experience. But I will note that the last school committee, there were 2 races that were completely open. Neither of them were contested, so there really were no you know, contested races, you know, for that. So the entire school committee, you know, was just reelected just by voting for themselves.
Exactly.
So, you know, part of what we're hoping to do through these programs in the league is to get more people interested in participating in civic discourse and all of the many volunteer opportunities, but then also to run for office. Okay, so let's get back to, you know, so people are on the street, like you talked about, you know, you were in the community and trying to figure out like what your next thing was going to be to contribute and how you're going to benefit your family and your community. And Alicia, you talked about a lot of the advocacy work that you had done and how you were going to take that to the city council. So you brought all that to the table. They said, okay, time for papers. You can pull papers, you go to City Hall, you sign your name on the register, you look to see if anybody else has also signed up there, and you get, ta-da, nomination papers. So we all know and love the nomination papers. I actually found that it was
Love
a really
might
good,
be a strong word.
well, you know, I actually found that it was a really great icebreaker. You know, when you go into the community, that you know you are required that you cannot get your name on the ballot, as you know, without getting certified signatures. So of course, you have to remind people to write legibly. People don't really know what's a ward and committee. Like, you know, they just there's a lot of education that goes with that. So I just wanted to point out that, you know, that's kind of, you know, where folks start. And then once that is handed in, then they become certified, and of course there is your name appears on the ballot. Here's a sample ballot. Do you remember how you get your name on the ballot? Like where your name appears? Just point of fact. If you have multiple people running, I actually had 5 people that I ran against. You know,
I think
I
it's
had
alphabetical,
it is.
No, they draw.
It's lots.
Yeah, they draw a lottery.
I thought it was just alphabetical.
No, they draw a lottery to determine who goes first, second, third, however. It's, yeah.
Yeah, it was, you know, I didn't mention before that there is sometimes a primary, you know, so when I ran first, you know, there was lots of people in Ward 8 that were really gung-ho about running for school committee. Yeah. So there were 5 of us, you know, ultimately, so we had a primary, and so the top 2 vote getters ended up advancing to the general election, and then it was just me against another person in the final, and so, you know, that was super exciting. And then, you know, of course, one of the things that we need to sign up for is the campaign finance committee, that there's a lot of regulation around campaign transparency and financing. And I'm just curious if you wanted to make any sort of comment about that, of where you can find out more information and, you know, who you chose as your treasurer.
Well, so there's a state group, the Office of Campaign Finance, and they have a website and they have training, and the training is excellent for first-time candidates. And so anybody who's considering running should definitely go to that and read their newsletters. And I think you can pretty much walk through it step by step. My treasurer ended up being one of my coworkers who was a pretty good friend. And managed my finances for all 3 of my election cycles.
My campaign finance person had actually run for school committee before, Andrea Steenstrup, and she was very knowledgeable, and it was great to be able to take that off didn't have to worry about anything. She just knew everything that needed to be done and all the rules, because there are a lot of rules, and I was big on following the rules. Not all candidates always follow the rules.
It's important to follow the rules.
We're rule followers, so we follow the rules. So.
I think that's great, and just the league obviously has a whole, in fact all of us have been working on it, right, putting together a set of resources that will help people run for office, which will have the website at the end of this program to give people an idea of where to go to get all of the play-by-play and all the great benefit of our experience and many other people in the league. We have a robust league here in Newton, as well as at the state and the national level, that we're pulling through resources there as well. So I'm afraid we have to wrap up. There's so much more we can talk about. I'm sure that there will be a sequel, to talk a little bit more about the exciting things that we did on school committee and on city council. But on behalf of the League of Women Voters, we wanted to thank you for joining us for this program and on this episode of League Presents. And we hope that it did give everybody an opportunity to learn more about running for office and for serving on the Newton City Council and on the Newton School Committee. And as you just heard, don't just stand there, run. If you want to contact the League of Women Voters with comments or ideas on future shows, or if you have a comment on this show in particular, we would love to hear more from you at info@lwvnewton.org. And a reminder that the specific comments and opinions expressed today do not necessarily represent those of the League, which is it's a separate process that we really have consensus meetings and things like that. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, multi-issue grassroots organization that encourages informed and active participation in local, state, and federal government. And the League develops positions on issues but does not support or oppose candidates or political parties. So you'll be able to view this program on newtv.org or on the Newton League's website, which is www.lwvnewton.org. And I want to thank you again, former elected officials Alicia Bowman and Kathy Shields, for joining us, and of course for your many years of service to the city. We know we're not going to see the last of you. We know that you're doing great things with the League of Women Voters, and we're going to get other people to follow in your footsteps. I guarantee it. Anyway, again, I'm Margie Ross Decter. I'm reminding you to be safe, well, and stay engaged. And remember, democracy is not a spectator sport.